Hi, my name is Yannick Lefebvre and I'm a WordPress plugin developer. Welcome to my presentation on plugin development best practices and troubleshooting user issues. This is a video capture of a presentation that I recently gave at WordCamp Montreal 2010. I'm going to be touching upon many different topics in this presentation. First of all, I'm going to give you a brief introduction of who I am and what's my relationship to WordPress and developing plugins. Then I'm going to move into what are the best practices when you're actually creating plugins. The main areas that I'm going to be covering are, first of all, talking about how you can avoid conflicts between WordPress plugins and other plugins, or WordPress plugins and themes that users are going to be installing on their blogs. In the second section of this presentation, I'm going to be discussing how you can maintain blog performance when you're writing code for your plugins. You always want to make sure that you're doing things that won't slow down the user experience. Next, I'm going to talk how you can make your plugins easy to use for people to really benefit from all the work that you're putting in these creations. And finally, I'm going to highlight a few general best practices when you're writing code and creating plugins for WordPress. So first of all, just to tell you a little bit about me, as I mentioned, my name is Yannick. I've been blogging since 2003. I actually moved into WordPress in 2004, migrating from Blogger. I really became a WordPress developer for plugins by necessity. What I mean by that is I had needs to fulfill on my site, and there were no plugins available to fulfill these needs. So I started to learn PHP and started to make my own plugins, and eventually started to publish these to a wider audience. My first plugin that I released was called Link Library, and that was released in March of 2005. Since then, including Link Library, I've actually published 5 different plugins. So Link Library is the first one, and I'll explain a little bit what that does. Tune Library is the second one that I released, followed by Weekly Schedule, Modal Dialog, and Community Events. So Link Library is a plugin that can be used to generate a page of links on a WordPress site. So WordPress has a great backend to be able to create link categories and enter links inside of each of these categories. But in terms of displaying the information that you're putting in there, all it has is a very simple widget that will just show a bullet list of your widgets. Now, I wanted to take advantage of all the information that I was entering in the back end. So things like the notes, the description, the image, all these extra elements I wanted to be able to display on screen so that people would be able to see these things. So I wrote Link Library as originally just a simple set of PHP functions that you could call from your site, and over time it grew. Now it has a full admin page, it has short code tags to be able to easily use Link Library on different pages. It has the ability to define multiple configurations to handle different link lists shown on different pages on your site. So there's really a lot of customizability and control over how you're going to configure things and how things are going to look. So the image you're seeing here is the plugin as it is used on my website today, and then this is an example of the plugin being used on a user site. So as you can see here, there's a different layout. This is a 2-column layout in this case. There's thumbnails of the different sites that are part of the Link Library in this case. All of these were actually generated automatically by the plugin, so there's no need to manually go in there and get the screenshots one by one. And then you can get to this kind of end result with a little bit of styling, playing with the style sheets and deciding how things are going to be rendered. The next one that I created was called Tune Library. So I got to a point where I wanted to let people know what kind of music I like to listen to. And so I developed a plugin that can basically import the XML file that iTunes uses to be able to store all of your data on which tracks you own or which tracks you have loaded up inside of your library. And then once this is loaded up inside of the WordPress database, then I have, again, a short code that you can put on a page that will extract the information, then let the user navigate through your music collection. So you can see there's things like the idea that artists and album can be collapsed and track lists will be available as you drill into the actual hierarchy. This is, once again, the site as it is used on my personal site, and then as it is used on one of my user sites. The third plugin that I developed is called Weekly Schedule. So this plugin was designed to be able to render a list of recurring weekly events on the site. So my goal here was that I wanted to tell people what kind of TV shows I like to listen to. And instead of just doing a simple table, I decided to build a plugin to do this, where I have a back-end admin section where I can enter the different events, and then a nice front-end section, as we can see here, where you can see a nice grid view of my schedule. As I hover over an item, I'm going to get a little thumbnail for that. As you can see, I'm a big fan of the Big Bang Theory, and so this is something that once I let this one out in the wild and uploaded this to the plugin repository, it started getting used on sites like online radio stations, as we can see here, or gyms. So here this is for a yoga, a gym with yoga classes, and so they have a schedule of when they have different classes available at their facility. The last two ones that I wrote were actually written for users. So I had users of my other plugins who contacted me and said that they needed help creating some capabilities for their site. And so I created two more plugins to be able to suit these needs. The first one is called Modal Dialogs. So this is a plugin that can create a pop-up on your site. Now, yes, they're annoying. As you can see, this particular user even acknowledges that right in the text. But in some cases, there's users that do want these pop-up dialogues to offer things to their visitors, such as registering for a newsletter or going to bringing the users to a different section of their site. So in this case, it will do things like display the dialogue, but also keep track of whether or not it's been displayed or how many times you want to display it. So there's a lot of options there to configure this. The last one is still in its infancy, and this is a plugin called Community Events. So in this plugin, what I'm doing is letting users be able to have a real event calendar where events will be tied to specific date and time, and afterwards you can navigate things like you can see weekly view of what's coming up, or get a full calendar of everything that's happening inside of that site, all the events that are being registered on there. So now, this being said, I'm going to jump right into the topic and talk about great. So now that you know where I'm coming from, the first section that I'm going to be discussing is how to avoid conflicts between your own plugin and other plugins or WordPress themes. And the first subtopic in this section is how do you avoid conflicts with jQuery. If you're not familiar with jQuery, it's a really powerful library that can let you create content that's going to be very dynamic. It's a JavaScript library that you can just load and then do things like have things fade in and fade out and slide and do easy AJAX queries. Now, while jQuery is great, and whenever you're using it, you can do very amazing things, it can also wreak total havoc on your site if you try to load more than one instance of jQuery. Now, that can happen if users or developers are not careful as they're developing themes or as they're writing their plugins. Now, here I would say that some plugins and a lot of themes make the mistake of directly loading their own copy of jQuery, even though there is one that's already delivered with WordPress. WordPress uses jQuery in a lot of the admin backend pages to be able to do things like the things we see, the fade in and fade out when you approve a comment or delete something. All these different things use jQuery in the back. Now, if users go in and load their own copy of jQuery, there's a good chance that it won't be the same one as WordPress, and that it's going to conflict with other plugins or themes that are using jQuery on the page. Now, the way to actually avoid this type of problem is to call this wonderful function that's available in WordPress that's called WPQ Script. And so you can call it with a single parameter, which is jQuery, and then it's going to load the jQuery up on your page. So the way this works is by just specifying jQuery here, it's going to load the version of jQuery that you provide with that is provided with WordPress. Now, the other thing it's going to do is it's going to manage requests to load jQuery from all themes and plugin, or from the theme and all of your plugins that are currently installed on the site, and make sure that it only loads once. So this way you can be sure that you're not going to have 5 versions of jQuery loaded on the site, you're only going to have a single version that gets loaded and that's going to be available. Now, that being said, you can still have issues with people not using this, or people who give different names to their version of jQuery, but already that can alleviate a lot of pain. Now, this function can actually be used for your own scripts or for other plugins and scripts that you find on the web. So there's up to 5 parameters that can be used for the WPQ Script function that can let you load any kind of JavaScript onto your site. So what you need to specify for the script function is a handle, the source, dependencies, version, and whether it should be in the footer. And you can also use something similar for styles. So if you have CSS style sheets that you need to load on the site, then you could do this. And again, if somebody else happens to be using the same CSS for a similar plugin, then it's going to only load once by using this function. Now, one thing to be aware of is that what these functions do is that they queue up these different requests, and then they output them inside of the WP head function call that's going to be inside of the theme header. So if you're trying to troubleshoot jQuery issues, the place that you should be looking is going to be in the page header, obviously. That's where your different references are going to be all related to jQuery and loading it. So what you're going to look in there is you're going to go down inside of the headers and just do a search on the word jQuery and see if you find more than one instance of that in there. If you do, well, there's a good chance that you'll find different versions, and that might be what's, or would be what's messing up with your different jQuery content on your page. Now, something to be aware of concerning jQuery, if you are going to use the method that I've just mentioned and load up the WordPress version of jQuery, is that it uses a no-conflict version of jQuery. Now, in this version, you actually need to write out the jQuery function name, and you can't just use a $ shorthand version of that function to be able to do all of your different jQuery code. If you just write $, you'll get an error that's going to be thrown by your browser saying that it can't recognize this function. Moving on to how to avoid conflicts with other plugin functions. So something to be aware of as a plugin developer is that any function that you're going to declare in your plugin is going to be global. So if you have duplicate names between your plugins and other plugins, you're going to get error messages. These will appear either during installation or during the actual refresh of your WordPress site. So what you should be careful about is to have unique names when you're writing on your own functions. You should also be really careful when you're doing some copy-paste. Copy-paste is great. You can find some great examples online. But if you do that, you should be careful and try to give unique names to your functions. So in general, what I would say here as a good practice would be to always prepend your function names with a unique identifier. So it could be something like here, LL for link library, in front of the function name. It could be the whole plugin name all spelled out. And so by doing this, then you're going to have a much better chance of having a unique function name inside of your plugin, as opposed to something very generic like HTTP get file, which in my case, I had a user install a plugin that had this exact same function name, and then there was a conflict. So avoid the headaches. Try to make sure that you have a prefix in front of all of your function names that's going to be unique to your own plugin. The next topic I want to talk about is avoiding problems with the WordPress automatic upgrade process. So since version 2.5, I can't remember exactly, there's been this great mechanism in WordPress that lets you automatically update plugins from the WordPress admin page. Now, that being said, while this mechanism can save you a lot of time and headaches, it can also create headaches specifically because of the way that it works. So when you say upgrade plugin, it's going to actually delete the entire plugin directory, and then it's going to load a new version of that plugin in there. What that means is that if you had any style sheet or any file that you expected the user to modify within your plugin, that file's gone. And it's going to be replaced by the original version of that file, meaning the user will lose all of his changes. So to work around that, well, unfortunately there's not that many solutions. Well, the first one isn't that great, and that is just to warn users to back up their files. That could be on the admin page, in the documentation, but we all know that users don't really read documentation. The other way to do it, which I found an interesting approach, is to try to really move all the content inside of your plugin. And so that means that for something like a style sheet, you would need to create a style sheet editor right inside of your plugin admin pages so that the users could go in and edit their styles, and then this would be something that gets stored inside of the database. So next time there's a new update that rolls up for your plugin, they can just do the upgrade worry-free, and then it's going to find the information that it needs right there inside of the database and be able to keep moving and not rely on a user manual update of files or bringing back an old backup of their modified file after they've done the automatic update. Now there's many other kinds of conflicts that can happen between WordPress and its different themes and plugins based on how a user has configured their site. The first one is that there's some plugins that depend on hooks to be able to do things inside of a WordPress installation. So for example, inside of the plugin code, you might be depending on queuing things to be printed in the header of the site or the footer of the site. So if you do that, well, then you're dependent on WP head or WP footer to actually be present in the theme. Now I've actually had some themes that I recently upgraded to on my websites that were missing the footer call, the WP_footer function. So in that case, well, you end up with something that's not working right. Unfortunately in this case, well, the only thing you can do when you're troubleshooting these things is, well, go and add documentation about the fact that there's dependencies on these things. And if you're trying to figure out, well, what's going on, if you're knowledgeable enough about what's happening in your plugin, then you can understand that there's things that are supposed to be out in the header or the footer and quickly look at these pieces of the page output to see what's missing. The next type of conflict that you can get into is conflicts with plugins that make their own changes to the page structure. So these days with things like jQuery, it's easy to go in and alter the page layout to be able to do a whole bunch of fancy things. So in my case, I had a user have a plugin installed that would give you a fade out and fade in effect whenever you would click on a link. And then he wrote to me saying, well, the link targets that I'm specifying in your plugin are not working. So after digging around the code of his page a little bit, I realized that the document object model, the DOM, was being played with, and so whatever targets were being set by my plugin based on what he would enter were all being overwritten. Similarly, I've had other plugins do nasty things like strip shortcodes. So I've had users have a shortcode in place and it wasn't working, and they would only see part of the shortcode on the output page. So these shortcodes were actually being stripped somewhere early on in the execution before WordPress actually had a chance to execute them and expand them to their full meaning. So unfortunately, the only way to be able to fix these kinds of issues is through live troubleshooting. So actually going in, looking around, activating and deactivating plugins that you suspect might be causing issues until you find the right one. Thankfully, at least in my case, I've had a lot of users that were very open to doing things like setting up a temp admin account for me, so I could actually go in and be able to see what's happening, do some of that experimentation myself, and then be able to give them a solution, or at least a way to be able to have their site work as they wanted. And so in some cases that means just leaving a plugin as being deactivated or replacing it. Finally, one thing to mention in terms of conflicts is that if you have a jQuery execution error on a page or a JavaScript execution error, that's going to bring down anything that's using these technologies. So if you have one plugin using jQuery that has an error inside of a function, well, that error is going to mean that all other jQuery code on that page is going to stop working correctly. So that's quite difficult to deal with. Again, the kind of thing you only realize through troubleshooting or through using great tools like Firebug, where you can actually go in and get errors that are going to tell you what's happening on the site. So at least there are some debugging capabilities there. And once you figure out where that's coming from, then you have a better idea of which plugin you should go in and try to deactivate and see if it fixes things. Something else to mention in terms of conflicts is that you can also have conflicts with the server installation. And by that, what I mean more specifically is that not all PHP or MySQL installations are equal. So there's various options that these different server packages have. For example, in PHP you have things like the short open tag that you can specify. That's not set by default. And so you should really avoid programming with these optional features in mind. So in the case of something like the PHP open tag, you should make sure that you're only writing your code with the full PHP open and close tags and not the short ones, because some people might not have them set and they might not have access to go and set these on their server. So going to the lowest common denominator would always be the safest thing to do here as a plugin developer to make sure that your plugins are going to run everywhere. This one I've learned the hard way when I forgot a few tags and then uploaded the plugin to my test server. It worked fine. Uploaded it to my live server. It worked fine. But sure enough, a couple of my users quickly came back to me and were having all sorts of strange error messages, and it was due to these open and close tags not being correct inside of my code. The next topic that I want to talk about is blog performance. And so here we're first going to talk about how script loading and parsing is going to affect a site performance. Any script or style sheet that you load from a plugin is going to be added to the page content and is going to increase the download time for that page and the render time. Now, depending on the nature of a plugin, it might actually not need to be loaded on all the pages of a blog. And so what I mean here specifically is if a plugin is trying to load scripts or style sheets, they might not need to be loaded on every single page of a site if your plugin is shortcode based and only renders contents on specific pages. So if you're inside of that situation and you want to only have your content show up on specific places, what you can use is a filter on the posts. So the post is something that's executed very early on inside the WordPress loop. And so what it's going to let you do is go in there and parse the content of the posts, and then afterwards do things like queue up a style or queue up a script based on whether or not you find a specific content. So if you're using shortcodes, these shortcodes will actually be available to you when the posts are being parsed out. They haven't been expanded yet to their full content. Now here we're using, if we actually see that there's a need to render that plugin content, then we're going to use that magical function that we talked about earlier called WPQ Script or style to be able to get that loaded up in the queue and output when the page header is rendered on the screen. The next thing to talk about concerning performance is to be careful with the database access that you do inside of your plugin. Now, inside of most plugins that have an admin page, you're going to have options. These options will be stored inside of the option table inside of your WordPress database. There are two utility functions that you can use to be able to retrieve data from that database and write data to it, and these are get option and update option. Now, that being said, some people use these not in the most efficient way. They're going to call get option and have a single name for every single option that they're going to have in their plugin. What that means is that at runtime, every time you make these calls to get options, you're going to be hitting the database, requesting information, and then passing on that information and deciding what to do based on how that particular option is set. A better way to do things is to use arrays. So get option and update option can work with single variables, or they can be used to store arrays. So in the sample code that we're seeing here, I'm retrieving an option called link library settings, and so that gets passed over to a variable, and afterwards I can just access the different members of that array, the different elements, and be able to see what data is inside of them. So with a single get option call, I can retrieve all options for my plugin and then just work through these over time. So that's one quick database query. I get my data and I can just keep going. Now, there's actually a second benefit to doing this other than performance, and that is scalability. So in the case of my plugin, Link Library, I wanted to be able to create multiple configurations so that you could have multiple different pages that would have on them link lists, and so these could be configured differently in terms of how you want them laid out or what link categories you want to see displayed. So in this case, having everything stored as an array just made it very easy to build a variable name including the ID of the setting set, and afterwards just retrieving that one element, and the rest of the code doesn't even really know that there's multiple configurations available. It just gets a set of options and it executes. The next topic under performance is to try to find ways to reduce page refreshes and how big your database queries are, or how much data they're going to return. So the first thing I must say here is that users are really good at finding ways to store a large amount of data in your database. So if you have a plugin that's data driven, they're going to fill it up really quickly. For example, I had a user that had more than 6,000 links inside of Link Library. He was actually using it for basically an anime torrent site, and so he would have all of these different links inside of this database. Another example is for Tune Library, so my iTunes-based plugin. I had a user with over 50,000 songs, so he quickly complained that things were not loading very fast since it had to query all this data and then render a page with all this information. Something else to be mentioned is that you have users that have a lot of content on their page. So they're going to have the output of your plugin somewhere on their website, but around that plugin, they're going to have a sidebar with things like a photo gallery or a fancy flash thing or a video or whatever it may be. They're going to have a lot of heavy content on their website. So refreshing a page over and over is going to be difficult for them if you have a content heavy plugin, because it might need to refresh the whole page. So there's two things you can do here to alleviate these two different issues. The first one is to only try to show a subset of the data when you first display the content of the plugin. So for example, in Tune Library, I've added options so that you can only show one letter at a time. So artists whose names start with that letter. So this way you only get a subset of your data that comes up, and afterwards you can choose other letters and be able to see this, what else is available inside of the data for that plugin. Now that being said, while this can work pretty nicely, you still have the issue of the page refresh. If you're using a basic HTML get method, when you click on a link, it's going to send a few parameters and then reload a whole page based on what the user selected. You still have the issue that the sidebar has to all reload and all these different other plugins have to load. So that's where you want to turn to something like Ajax. By using Ajax, you can actually only refresh that part of the page that your plugin is rendering with a new set of data. So going back to Tune Library, when I click a new artist letter, I can only refresh the list of artists and their associated albums and tracks and not have to refresh the whole website. Now, there's libraries like jQuery that make it very easy to do Ajax queries to be able to retrieve that data and then render it back on the site. So once you have your functionality in place, you've made sure you've avoided conflicts with other plugins and you've made sure that your plugin performs well, you want to make sure that users get the most of it. And so there's different ways you can do that in terms of adding extra capabilities to the back end or other elements to be able to make it easy for users to start using your plugin. Because it's really easy for somebody to download a plugin, not understand how it works, delete it, and just keep looking for what they need and what they can easily figure out. While your plugin might have been the best one at what it does, if they can't figure it out, they're going to keep moving. So the first area is translation. There's a wonderful mechanism in WordPress that's built in that can let you easily make text strings translatable so that you can have the whole admin page show up in different languages. WordPress itself uses this to be able to provide translations of the whole WordPress backend to different languages. Something to be aware of is that the user community is very eager to give back to the plugin developers by providing translations. I've translated my first plugin about a month ago, and I've already had 2 users out of nowhere contact me and tell me, well, I'm working on a plugin for my language, and I'll soon be sending you something over. So you should soon be seeing Link Library in Brazilian and in Danish based on some things that some of my users have done. So the way to work with translation, there's actually a few different things to be done in terms of the plugin development, is first of all to load what's called a text domain. So what you specify here is a name for a text domain and then a path to where your language files are going to be located. A translation file is really just translating a list of combinations of strings. So you're going to have the string in the original language, maybe English, and then you're going to have the string in some foreign language, be it French, Italian, or whatnot. At runtime afterwards, WordPress is going to figure out which string to use. So it's, every time it needs to render a string, it's going to look it up. Now what's going to tell it to do that lookup is to use one of the two following functions. So you have, first of all, the _e function that will echo the string or its translation to the screen. So you have the _e function that takes two parameters, the string, and then once again that's that text domain that we define in the first function call. Now if you don't want to output the translated string, if you want to put it inside of a variable and do something with it, then what you can use is the __ function. It looks a little bit weird on screen, but it is the function that will once again look up a string, figure out its translation, and give it back to you so that you can use it on the screen. Now in terms of creating these translations, there's actually plugins in WordPress to be able to do this. So admin plugins that will let you modify and write up a translation files, or there's desktop clients like POEdit that will actually let you load up a file and then be able to create a translation for any given language. The next thing that you can do for users is to try to add tooltips to your admin pages. So as I mentioned before, users are not great at reading documentation, nor facts, nor anything that means they have to read stuff. So what you can do is have tooltips inside the interface so that whenever they hover over a field or click inside of it, then they're going to get some help that's specific to that part of the admin page that's going to tell them how to use that element. So this can be great both for new users so that they can figure out how to use things, or if there's things that are kind of complicated and you might even want a reminder when you're doing it for the 5th time or the 10th time, then these will come up and give that contextual information to your user. So to implement tooltips, what I've used myself a lot is the Tiptip plugin. So that's a jQuery plugin, and I have the address here on the slide. And the effect that you get to see when you actually have a field is you get a nice little semi-transparent box that's going to have various text information in there, and then the user can read that as he's hovering in the box or as he's clicked inside of it, and then he can know what he has to do for that part of the admin interface. The next thing that I do a lot in my plugins is try to think about adding a debug mode inside of there. So the debug mode is something that typically users would turn on when you're trying to help them figure out why the plugin isn't behaving as you expect to on their site. So users could go in the back end, check a box, save their settings, and then afterwards you would get extra information. Now the way I've done that to be able to avoid downtime on people's site is to add debug information as HTML comments in the page. So visually you don't see it. It does take a little bit longer to render the page based on how many comments you're going to be spitting out, but at least this way it's invisible to visitors on the website. Now, the kind of information that I spit out inside of these comments is things like plugin options. So just write out what all the options are, and in this way you can scan and figure out if they've configured something wrong. I also do things like put queries in there to see if there's a query that's getting a strange parameter or not being put together properly as expected. The query results, so to figure out if there's just something wrong with the results and what's coming out of the user's database. To work with these things, the printr function is great to be able to easily see what's inside of variables and print it on screen, and then just your standard HTML comment tags around those will just do great. And so an example kind of output that I might be producing when users activate debug mode is something like this here, where we can see this is the categories output, and then here's the query that's being executed. So then I can easily go in there and understand what's happening, and I might see something very obvious in terms of the syntax that's wrong. Something else I've done in the past is also be able to copy and paste these queries and bring them on my own server and then run them, and my phpMyAdmin page might go in there and tell me that there's something wrong with the query, and now I'll quickly be able to put my finger on it. A few last good practices before I conclude this presentation. The first one is to always think of backward compatibility. As soon as you're going to think about removing a feature, somebody is going to let you know that they're using it. So I know in my case, when I started to introduce the admin page and the shortcodes, I thought, well, people won't need to use the core PHP functions on their sites to be able to do these things. They'll much prefer using the nice interfaces and the nice shortcodes. Well, I was wrong, and very quickly some users started to tell me that their whole site relied on having these functions in place. So I brought them back, and now I always make sure as I'm moving forward that I always keep all the capability there as is, as I'm introducing new things. Of course, I might fix a bug somewhere, but if I'm adding something new, I'm making sure I don't break something that was there before, and I don't remove things on purpose. The next thing I want to mention is you should think of all the different types of users when you have to think about upgrade procedures. So let's say, for example, you have a plugin that writes its own tables or modifies things in the database. When that plugin gets upgraded, if you want to add an extra field to a table, well, you might want to do that on the deactivation or the activation procedure. But what about those people that do manual upgrades? I know I personally like to do that. I just get my files, upload them to my site via FTP, and then run them through and just keep running. I don't bother going and deactivating and reactivating the plugin. So here what you can do, well, there's a few things. You can always keep a version number in your plugin options so that you can compare against that afterwards during execution, either when you're rendering the admin page or when you're rendering the actual output of your plugin. And then if the version is wrong, then you could go and run the activation function. So you could go and actually do what the user thought he was avoiding, and the first time he's going to go into the admin page or see the output of the plugin, he's going to have done the upgrade, and then that's going to make sure everything is fixed. So add fields to your database or whatnot, and then you can just move forward with your website and not have to worry about all these different things inside of your plugin. So that's it. Thank you very much for watching this. I hope you enjoyed learning about all of these different best practices in plugin development. You can view my site at the address below. Drop me an email if you have any questions on the different topics that I covered, or read more about my different plugins once again on my site on my WordPress plugins page. Thanks. Bye-bye.